Hi, I'm Ron and welcome to PopScicle, where I talk about popular culture, science, and everything in between. In case you're new to this channel, I'm Ron. I'm a biology professor and researcher, but I'm also a student of popular culture. I love all sorts of music, TV series, movies being my greatest passion, anime, RPGs, and all sorts of aspects of popular culture. And really, that's what this channel is all about: combining my interests in science and popular culture and just really having an opportunity to talk about the things that I like talking about and I like doing in terms of popular culture. Now, anyone who has been looking at the videos in my channel would know that I am a big fan of horror cinema. In fact, I've written several articles about it, particularly about body horror, but all in all, it's my favorite genre in cinema. And so this particular episode, while celebrating horror, is also meant to be part of the series that I started with an earlier video. And this is a series celebrating women during International Women's Month. The last video that I made was celebrating kick-ass anime women. Now in this video, I'm going to be celebrating the most iconic female performances in horror cinema. Now, just to clarify, when I mean iconic, I don't necessarily mean the best performances. Otherwise, you'd see some of the best actresses here who gave the most outstanding performances. Like, for example, in more recent years, you'd see Essie Davis from The Babadook, Toni Collette from Hereditary, Lupita Nyong'o, of course, from Us, and several others that you would expect in a list if the list were about high caliber performances. But that's not what this list is about. This list is about how iconic these characters are. Not just the characters, but the way they were acted by these actresses. So this is in honor of the actresses who made the characters their own, who gave them so much life, and made them fixtures in our mind whenever we think of horror culture in cinema. These are the names of actresses and their characters that no one who loves horror cinema or even has just a casual knowledge of horror cinema would forget. And uh, and because of that, of course, they are definitely worth celebrating. I will be talking about each of the top 15 iconic female performances in horror cinema. But before going into the top 15, I'd like to show you the honorable mentions. At number 20 is Samantha Eggar, who was a frightening, monstrous maternal figure in The Brood. At number 19 is Barbara Steele, a true legend of Italian horror cinema, who became popular because of her role and performance in Mask of the Demon. At number 18 is the aforementioned Essie Davis from The Babadook, certainly one of the best female performances in horror cinema or even in any genre for that matter. And she was part of that wave that really repopularized and brought to a higher level horror cinema. At number 17 is Eihi Shiina from Audition. Anyone who is a fan of Japanese horror would be familiar with this film and would be frightened just hearing of the name of this actress and being reminded of the role. And at number 16 is Drew Barrymore from Scream, who of course repopularized the slasher genre, which before this film came out in the late 90s had taken a backseat to other genres. And Drew Barrymore's is certainly the most memorable performance, although it was a short-lived role. Now let's go to the top 15 iconic female performances in horror cinema. Starting with number 15, Toni Collette from Hereditary. In Hereditary, which most people who love horror would tend to consider one of the best horror films ever made, and certainly one of the best that were released in recent years, Toni Collette stars as Annie Graham, and she knocks it out of the park. So performance-wise, this would be one of the top 5, definitely. But we're talking about iconic performances here, and this is pretty new, so it doesn't quite have the iconic legendary status as many of the others in this list yet. Okay? But given that it's a very new performance, it just came out within the last few years, it already deserves the label of iconic, because who would forget how fantastic the performance is, how committed Toni Collette was to the performance, especially that dinner scene, that explosive dinner scene, and of course the scenes where she started really breaking down near the end of the film. The film itself is excellent, but I think it's safe to say that it wouldn't have been the success that it was if not for Toni Collette's fierce, committed performance as Annie Graham, turning her into one of the most memorable characters in horror cinema, definitely one of the most memorable mothers in horror cinema, and anyone who is a fan of horror would know the important role of mothers in the genre. At number 14 is another fierce mother, and this is Shelley Duvall from The Shining. Shelley Duvall plays Wendy Torrance, of course, opposite Jack Nicholson's crazy, manic Jack Torrance in The Shining. Many horror fans consider this to be the best horror film ever made. It's playing at either number 1 or number 2 in most lists. It's in my top 3, in my own personal list, which I'm providing a link to down below. And one of the things that really makes it so effective is the claustrophobia that you feel in the Overlook Hotel that that really justifies what happens to Jack Torrance, driving him insane, and then also driving to great paranoia uh, the character of Wendy. I mean, the paranoia is not unfounded, of course, as we quickly find out. It's hard to imagine an actress pulling off the fear, the terror, the sheer terror, and the fierce maternal uh, protective urge, protective tendency that Shelley Duvall shows here. Uh, to begin with, she has this frail appearance that really lends well to this vulnerable, fragile role. Anyone who looked tougher would have probably failed at bringing across that frailty and that weakness, that physical weakness, which nevertheless she ultimately transcends with that maternal fierceness. So she overcomes the physical weakness and is able to, get out of that house along with her son, uh, and and that's all despite being quite physically limited. And again, we owe that to the singular talent and commitment of Shelley Duvall. Anyone who has studied the making of this film would know how Stanley Kubrick was torturous almost toward Shelley Duvall, just trying to get the right emotion and the right motivation from the actress during some of the critical scenes. And it's painful to hear that Shelley Duvall had to go through that, but the the end product is amazing to behold. I wish she didn't have to suffer to be able to give us that, but it's undeniable how much she did end up giving us in The Shining. At number 13 is the ultimate in bad kids. Forget Macaulay Culkin in The Good Son. Forget all of those other roles. It all goes back to Patty McCormack, who scared a whole generation of people by playing the evil Rhoda Penmark in The Bad Seed. This performance even gained her an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actress, which isn't very common. As you know, probably, having seen the very, very painful snubs for Toni Collette and more recently Lupita Nyong'o, the Oscars haven't really looked very favorably on horror roles. Uh, Much less on younger contenders. Although the supporting actress category has been historically the friendliest category to very young actors. And this is certainly deserved because there was nothing, probably that year, there was nothing more chilling than Rhoda Penmark. I mean, it's chilling enough to see a murderous adult, but if to see it in such a young child who pretends to be innocent, okay, but when you turn your back, you see the evil glint, the malicious glint in her eyes. It's really scary. She's precocious in the worst possible way, in a murderous way. And it's quite difficult for someone so young to pull off such chilling malice. But Patty McCormack does it so excellently. And no one who has ever watched The Bad Seed would ever forget that performance and the feelings that it elicited in them. At number 12 is the worst neighbor that you could ever have, and that is Ruth Gordon, who plays Minnie Castevet in Rosemary's Baby. At first glance, she's just seems to be a nosy, overcaring, overzealous neighbor, which most of us have had. But that's not too bad, right? Especially because she seems to be always willing to lend an ear, lend a helpful hand when you need it. Sometimes it goes overboard, but certainly that's much better than the actual truth, which is that she's part of a coven of Satanists uh, who are hell-bent on impregnating the next innocent woman that they see with the child of Satan. Yes, it's very insidious, it's very creepy. The way she unmasks herself and the way the neighbors, the other neighbors, unmask themselves is quite eerie and very disturbing, actually, especially in the context of that urban, that urban claustrophobia and closeness, where you you rely on someone so much and then you lose trust almost immediately because of the revelation that your neighbor is actually a Satanist. Um, and Ruth Gordon is amazing in it. It's no surprise that she won the Oscar, although again that's quite rare for a horror performance. She certainly deserved that. I mean, she's been a well-respected writer and actress for quite a long time. Anyone who is a fan of cult cinema and American cinema would know her for Harold and Maude, an amazing, amazing movie where she turns in a ferocious performance. The performance is very different here, uh, but it's no less delicious. That's probably a great word to describe her performances, both in Harold and Maude and here in Rosemary's Baby. It's delicious, but here it's delicious in a very very tainted, dangerous, poisonous way. And some of the best performances are like that. They sneak up on you all of a sudden. And probably no other actress could have done it just as well as Ruth Gordon. At number 11 is probably one of the most highly regarded performances, and certainly this would rank in the top 3 if this were a list of the top of the best performances. And this is a Cannes award-winning performance. This is Isabelle Adjani in Possession. The French legend Isabelle Adjani plays actually two roles, Anna and Helen, but the more important one is of course Anna. And it's it's so bizarre. It's such a bizarre film with such a bizarre performance from Isabelle Adjani. It's unhinged. Really, that's probably the perfect word for it. It's unhinged. And there is no other scene that shows that better than the scene in the tunnel, where for several minutes she just contorts and wails and moans and spews out stuff. It's body horror, actually. And you can see there the level of commitment of this actress who is so highly regarded for dramas and historical pieces. But here she's lending her excellence and her drive and her passion to horror cinema in such an amazing, uh, incomparable way. I don't know if any other actress could have been as committed and as fierce in delivering that type of zany, almost unbelievable performance that a weaker actress would have made funny, probably, but there was nothing funny about it. There was a lot to be disturbed about. There was a lot to be unsettled about, and that was the power of Isabel Adjani. For the rest of the film, there are a lot of other great things to say about her performance, but really what makes it as iconic as it really is that scene in the tunnel. Don't watch it unless you're prepared to be disturbed and unsettled, because it is one of the most unsettling films and unsettling scenes that you can watch in horror cinema. And Isabella Gianni makes it work. No one else could have, probably. She certainly deserved an Oscar nomination for that one, and that's again a sign of the lamentable trend where the Academy fails to honor uh, acting in horror as it should. Now we're in the top 10 iconic female performances in horror cinema, and at number 10 we have an Oscar-winning performance, Kathy Bates in Misery. Who would forget that scene where she uses a sledgehammer Sorry for reminding you of that. And in fact, Kathy Bates apologized to the audience when she accepted her Oscar. During her speech, she said sorry for that scene. But yes, it's forgiven, first and foremost. She didn't have to apologize for turning in an Oscar caliber performance. Again, that's a rarity. It's a rarity for such a performance, a wicked performance in a horror film, to 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 be nominated, let alone win. But I suppose in that year it was undeniable because as Annie Wilkes, she made an icon of that character. She's so iconic, Annie Wilkes, that she has her own miniseries now, as some of you might know. This is probably even before Perfect Blue and The Fan. This was really the film that made fandom a scary thing, that made celebrities fearful of their fans. This is the ultimate crazy fan movie. And Kathy Bates was all sorts of nice. I mean, as Annie Wilkes was all sorts of nice at first, and then you began to see the cracks in her facade, and you began to see the crazy, and that's when things really got scary. And again, it's difficult to imagine another actress that could have made this role as perfectly zany and scary and unyielding as it was. And that's why the role has become so iconic. That's really because of the power of Kathy Bates as an actress. At number 9 is someone you might not have expected because we don't actually see her face, we just see her eye. And this is Rie Inoue from Ringo as Sadako. Who would forget Sadako, right? The American remake is good and all, but I always disagree with any best or top horror list that lists the American remake and not the Japanese film. Respect where it's due. Definitely the Japanese film is superior to the American film. Right? Despite the good qualities to the American film. The atmosphere that it creates. And of course, the monster that it creates. The monster that it unleashes upon the world. Anyone who watched Ringo or Ring probably ignored their TV sets for a while because they were too scared of it. Actually, the American film didn't quite capture the horror of it. Because I remember that scene being bright, actually. Whereas that whole scene where Sadako comes out of the TV set in the original Ringo was set in a very dark, cramped space, and then the music was perfect. And that wasn't captured by the American remake. Also, the other thing that was not captured by the American remake was the horror of Sadako herself. They turned her into a child called Samara. And yes, we've proven with Patty McCormack and Rhoda Penmark that children can be scary. But in Ringo, Rie Inoue, who I believe is a dancer, was able to use her skills at contorting her body to show how damaged and how shattered the body of Sadako is when she crawls out of that well and out of the TV and onto the ground and starts that spasmic contortion of her body. That was chilling. Uh, if she had just come out straight out of the TV, it wouldn't have been as scary. But then the contortions made it extra terrifying. Samara tried to copy that, but the way they did it was like static, which was so artificial. Here in Ringu, Inoue really used her body. It was very natural and organic, and that's what gave it another level of horror. To a certain extent, it is body horror. I do consider it, at least that scene, body horror because it does show the manipulation and warping of the body, and that's what makes it scary. And hats off to Inoue for doing that and giving us the nightmare of our lives, really. Uh, if we were to rank horror women, horror monster women, Sadako would probably be at the top or near the top. Before the mother-daughter pair of scream queens that would be appearing later in this list, there was the legendary Fay Wray from King Kong. Fay Wray plays Anne Darrow. Who doesn't know Anne Darrow, right? Even if you watch the remake by Peter Jackson in 2005, you'd know who Anne Darrow is. Well, of course, she was played by Naomi Watts. But in the original 1930s movie, no one did it better. No one could have done it better than Fay Wray, who was the original Scream Queen. And in fact, I believe there was a Scream-like Fay Ray contest after the film was shown. That's how popular it became. And really, I mean, the Scream is iconic. That scene where she was being held in the hand of King Kong atop the Empire State Building is, of course, iconic. And in fact, when she died, the Empire State Building celebrated her life uh, publicly. And that tells you, I think that's the perfect way to see how iconic this performance has been. Yes, not a lot of people, especially modern fans of horror, would remember it or would even know it, but uh, by and large, fans of horror cinema or sci-fi cinema or cinema in general, actually, that's the most important thing. Fans of cinema in general would definitely consider Fay Ray's performance in this iconic film iconic in itself. And that's why she certainly deserves a place in any list of iconic actresses in cinema, especially horror. At number 7 is the Oscar favorite. Before Meryl Streep, before Katharine Hepburn, there was Betty Davis, and she was all sorts of scary and crazy in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. She plays Baby Jane Hudson with fierce commitment, as she always does her roles, and her her makeup and her general mannerisms really made this film that an example of that film which isn't really horror per se, but it's almost grand guignol in its flavor, uh, and you can see the crazy leaking out of her of 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 baby Jane Hudson in many different instances. Of course, the rat scene and the scene where she sings her song for her daddy. Those are scenes that raise goosebumps. And while some other actresses could have interpreted it probably just as effectively, uh, it's still difficult to imagine anyone doing it uh, with such ferocious uh, glee, ferocious and terrifying glee as Betty Davis. It probably helped that she was making her co-star suffer. We all know that she didn't like Joan Crawford. They hated each other with gusto. And I believe that really translated into uh, a wickedly vicious performance that was fully committed because um, in some ways Betty Davis was just acting out her own annoyance and her own anger toward Joan Crawford. But whatever the reason, if whether or not that's true, it is a performance for the books, and in fact, it got an Oscar nomination. Side note, I believe that Joan Crawford also deserved an Oscar nomination, but Betty Davis has always been the bigger star. I hope the ghost of Joan Crawford doesn't haunt me. And we as horror fans have to celebrate the fact that such an excellent actress, one of the true legends of cinema, of world cinema, decided to do this movie and give us one of the most iconic horror performances of all time. At number 6 is the daughter in the mother-daughter pair that I mentioned. One of the ultimate scream queens of horror cinema, Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween. First of all, Halloween is one of the best horror films ever made. And then you have this survivor female, a trope in horror cinema, the lone surviving female, played excellently by Jamie Lee Curtis. She, of course, plays Laurie Strode, a now iconic character who has had several iterations, including in the recent installment of the franchise. Yes, it's nice to revisit that role from time to time, and we will revisit it another time, I think, in an upcoming sequel. But there's nothing better than the original. Uh, Here we see a strong female character who beats the odds. She started that whole trope of being the lone surviving female. And while the others were a bit more frail and fragile, uh, there were very few things that you could say were weak and fragile about Laurie Strode. She was strong to begin with. And of course, the one of the most iconic things about her performance is the scream. Uh, and a lot of people have tried to copy that. A lot of people have tried to capture the fear that you see in Jamie Lee Curtis's face. Uh, but few have succeeded because it's iconic and legendary for that reason. It's hard to copy. It's hard to capture lightning in a bottle twice, right? And she is a pioneer, definitely, in this type of movie. And so Jamie Lee Curtis will forever hold a special place in the pantheon of horror cinema. At number 5, we have two actresses playing essentially the same role but in different faces. This slot is for Linda Blair and Mercedes McCambridge in The Exorcist. So why two actresses? Anyone who has read on the behind the scenes of The Exorcist, my favorite horror film of all time, and many people's as well, would know that while Reagan McNeil, the child, was played by Oscar nominee Linda Blair, the voice of Pazuzu was Mercedes McCambridge's. And Mercedes McCambridge is also an Oscar-nominated actress, but not for this film. So the two of them worked together, not really physically and literally, because I don't think Mercedes McCambridge was at the set. I'm not sure about that. Correct me if I'm wrong. But the tandem was hellish. It's the one of it's probably the most hellish performance out of all these things. Out of all horror monsters, this is the most diabolical. Literally, because it is a devil. It is something from hell. And anyone who has watched this movie would be lying if they say they were not affected by it. It's the best of all spiritual horror films. And really, Reagan McNeil is the ultimate in abjection, which is a concept in horror. The abnormal, right? And again, the diabolical. Uh, Even without the voice, you see the physical contortions and the gestures and the facial tics. And that's all Linda Blair, of course. And that's why it's really sad that she lost the Oscar to incidentally to another young child, Tatum O'Neal. But the voice, which is so iconic now, also, that's Pazuzu, that's Mercedes McCambridge. And so combined, the talents of these two actresses created a singular iconic character in the form of Reagan McNeil slash Pazuzu, which no other possession film could ever match. Uh, and yes, we owe it to the talents of these two actresses. We owe the horror of The Exorcist to these two actresses. At number 4 is the mother and the mother-daughter pair. We have Janet Leigh in Psycho. It's probably the most iconic scene in horror cinema, the shower scene in Psycho, with that very shrill scoring in the background, and of course, the indelible face of Janet Leigh screaming while she's facing her death. And so, I mean, it's Alfred Hitchcock. It's an iconic film, an iconic scene, and um, by playing Marion Crane, Janet Leigh actually got an Oscar nomination, which is deserved. And it's iconic not only in the way she handles that scene, which is of course excellently and sort of anticipates the performance of her own daughter in her own horror films, in her own scream fests. Um, but it's also iconic because it's a role that's so big that you think it's going to be the main role for the rest of the film. But then, spoiler alert, she dies quite early from said shower scene. And then we don't see her anymore on screen. So that was a bit jolting. Um, but that only lent the gravitas to not only the whole movie itself, but to the performance or what little we saw of it. She was an interesting character at the beginning. Um, you wouldn't really expect that that scene would happen, and so that's why Hitchcock was very wary of spoilers getting out, because he knew that was the money shot. That sequence would make or break the film, and of course, it made the film. It made the film a legend and made an icon of Janet Leigh. Definitely, she wouldn't be as iconic if she had not made this film. And while of course it can be argued that other actresses could have made their or given it their own spin and probably made it just as memorable, what matters is that Janet Leigh was in the right role at the right time, and she made the best of it. She was able to show how helpless that particular situation was, and she was able to show future horror movie actresses how it's done, particularly how to scream in such a horrible situation. We're now in our top three, and at third is Elsa Lanchester in The Bride of Frankenstein. Now, the Bride of Frankenstein herself is iconic enough with that look, with that hair, and that blank stare, and her gestures of moving away from the Frankenstein's monster. That in itself would have solidified her place in any list of iconic characters, iconic performances in cinema, especially in horror cinema. But then you add to that the fact that she also played Mary Shelley, the author of the book on which the movie was based. One of the true pioneers of science fiction, because many scholars consider Frankenstein to be the first science fiction novel. And so Lanchester, an Oscar nominated actress later on, showed her skill both as an innocent monster, an innocent undead creature, essentially a golem, and as an author, as Mary Shelley herself. This multitasking was amazing to behold, of course. But definitely, what makes the role iconic is the Bride of Frankenstein performance and look. No one would ever forget that. And a lot of people consider this to be one of the best horror films ever made. At number two is Sigourney Weaver from Aliens. This was a surprising but of course deserving Oscar nomination. It's not often that sequels would get Oscar nominated, especially for performances, but here you have an undeniable performance by Sigourney Weaver. She challenged so many norms about women's roles at that time, because here you can see a fierce warrior woman, still unmatched to this day. Yes, we can cite characters like Sarah Connor, of course, but really, you go back to Ellen Ripley and you immediately say legend, true icon of cinema in general. So, of course, in a horror list, she has to be, well, the top three at least, right? Um, she should be an icon up till now for female empowerment, because she showed strength of character, strength of will, strength of body also, and fierceness, maternal protectiveness. And that is ultimately a very important message. You are powerful as a woman. That's what Ellen Ripley showed everyone while kicking alien ass, which no one does better. And Sigourney Weaver has always been an excellent actress, so no one could have played Ellen Ripley just as well. And finally, at number one, you've probably been able to predict it already, because what other name is missing from this list other than Sissy Spacek from Carrie? Carrie White, uh, iconic role, iconic character in musicals, in TV series, in remakes. But you go back to the original, of course, based on the Stephen King novel, and you think about Sissy Spacek, a respected actress who was one in the Oscars, nominated for several Oscars, a true legend in cinema. She's much older than the role suggests, I mean, as an actress, but she was able to convince us that she was a teenager who was going through all of these teenage problems with a religious over a zealous parent, with bullies in school. We go through that journey with her as she discovers her abilities, as she goes through her first menstruation, as she goes through pangs of love, and as she is betrayed in that gym during the prom, and we're with her. It's cathartic when she enacts her revenge upon the people. We are scared, we are terrified, but at the same time we feel that there's justice in it, and that probably makes us feel guilty and scared of ourselves. And that's all due to, yes, the direction by Brian De Palma, most certainly, also the scoring, the cinematography, but in large part, the performance of Sissy Spacek as Carrie White. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. It's it would also definitely make it to the top level of any list of best horror performances. Iconic, certainly. It's, and I argue, by placing it at first, it's the most iconic female performance in horror cinema of all time. Even people who have a casual interest in horror would know who Carrie is because of the remix, yes, but they've probably seen stills of Sissy Spacek drenched in blood, wide-eyed, scared and horrified and angry, and ready to unleash her powers on the people who have wronged her. It's a revenge tale. It's a tale of innocence. It's a coming of age tale, definitely. But it is true horror. And Sissy Spacek was able to juggle all of that expertly. Fragility, innocence, monstrous rage. Um, and we are thankful. We are thankful that Sissy Spacek was there to do such justice to that most iconic of roles. And so that was my list of most iconic female performances in horror cinema. Did I miss out on anything? Please feel free to comment below. I'd love to have a conversation with you about this. Now, if you enjoyed that video and you would like to see more on horror and other aspects of popular culture, science, and in the intersections between them, don't forget to subscribe to PopScicle so that you may be alerted to new content in the future. See you again next time.